mensen, sorry, het is nog niet een Brabantse kwartiertje, dus wij zijn bijna op tijd. Welkom in het Vanabbemuseum. We hebben het ook in gebarentaal vandaag, zowel in het Nederlands als in het Engels. Ja, beste mensen, gelukkige mensen mag ik zeggen. Ik denk wij kunnen allemaal gelukkig zijn vandaag, omdat het is ons 80 jaar verjaardag, en het is 80 verjaardag. Het is een heel bijzonder moment, nee? Dat je 80 jaar bestaat. Dat betekent een bepaalde duurzaamheid voor zo'n instelling. Die gaat over het hedendaagse leven, hedendaagse kunst. 80 jaar hedendaagse kunst eigenlijk in Eindhoven. En ik vind het ook goed om als moment om even bij stil te staan, om te denken hoe belangrijk zulke instellingen, zoals het Vanabbemuseum, voor de verbeelding van een stad, voor de vermogen van een stad mogen zijn. Ja, wij zijn veel duurzamer, en ik zie de wethouder hier, maar wij zijn veel duurzamer dan de politiek van de dag. Eigenlijk. Wij gaan door. Regen en sneeuw, maar ook een beetje zon soms. Maar wij gaan door als instelling. En zeker als directeur, ik ben nu directeur bijna 12 jaar geweest. Maar er zijn voortgangers die waren boven de 20 jaar hier geweest. Dus ik ben nog jong in die zin. En wat je ziet is dat in iedere moment in de geschiedenis van het Abbemuseum is er altijd een eigenzinnig tegenstrijdige relatie met de kunst. Welke kunst belangrijk is, welke kunst niet belangrijk is. Maar ook met de maatschappij. Omdat het Abbemuseum is vanaf het begin af een tegenstrijdig museum geworden. Een museum die wil iets laten zien die misschien niet op dat moment goed ontvangen zal worden. Maar durft wel de nodige dingen te laten zien. En als je teruggaat naar de tijd van John Lering en zijn collega's, of de tijd zelfs van Eddie de Wilde, die heeft een vreselijke Picasso gekocht in de jaren 50. Als je teruggaat, dan zie je de waarde van dat tegenstrijdigheid. En ik denk, dat is iets wat wij moeten koesteren. Maar het is ook iets, wat mij betreft, als soort binnenbuitenstaander van Eindhoven. Ik zie het wel als een kenmerk voor Eindhoven zelf. Ja, het is geen mooie stad in de zin dat alles goed loopt en wij kunnen allemaal genieten van de Bourgondische levensstijl of zoiets. Nee, het is meer een stad die iets doet, die probeert iets te presteren, die macht, die durft. En dat vind ik wel een belangrijk kenmerk voor hier. En dus dat het Vanabbemuseum eigenlijk veel meer dan misschien wij weten in het museum en ook daarbuiten, hoort bij deze stad. Het Abbemuseum zal nooit in Rotterdam, of in Maastricht, of in Amsterdam, of in Antwerpen kunnen zijn. Dat had geen 80 jaar geleefd volgens mij. En eigenlijk is dat de kern van deze verjaardag. Dat wij deel van deze stad zijn, maar ook in soms moeilijke deel. Maar dat is ook terecht, volgens mij. Dus wij kunnen gelukkig zijn van ons eigenzinnigheid. En wij kunnen gelukkig zijn dat wij voor de tijden voor ons, in de volgende jaren, wel dat tegenstrijdigheid, dat eigenzinnigheid, dat onconventionele beleid en eigenschap kunnen koesteren. Nu schakel ik over in het Engels, als dat oké is. En ik hoop voor jullie, omdat wij hebben heel veel internationale gasten. Dus ik zou het nu, I'm now going to speak in English. It has to be that moment of switch. So once again, thank you for coming. I'm not going to repeat what I just said. But I am going to do the formal part a little bit and say thank you to a few people who have supported this exhibition, and then tell a little bit about the story of what you are going to see in the opening here. And then ask Zdenka Badabinac, who is the curator of a major part of the exhibition, the NSK, to talk more about that particular part, because in a way that's the part that's most distant from us, but maybe in some ways, in a strange way, the most relevant of all three, in a certain way. So my thank yous are to the Bos Grand Tour, the Bos Grand Tour, that has been organised, as you know, in connection with the Jeroen Bos exhibition, which is in Brabant. There's 7 museums that have worked together, and we're one of those, and we've concentrated on the 1980s. Now we have to say we were more concerned with our number game. Yeah, we are 80 years old, we're 80 hours open, and this is an exhibition about the 1980s. That was our concern. But also there are strange comparisons with Jeroen Bos, and I think particularly in the first room when you go in and you see the work by Rob Scholte on the wall, that there is in the Beeldtaal, in the language of the images, there is a strange connection to that. And perhaps that's something that sits in the DNA of the Dutch culture. This is then thank you to the Hieronymus Bos 500 Foundation, the Provincie Noord-Brabant that also have helped us, and Gemeente Den Bosch. I'd also like to thank our funders for the exhibition as a whole, and Nick's just walked off with the list. The Culture from the European Union, the Mondrian, the Art of Impact, the British Council, and various other people who have lent work to the exhibition. Because it's the 1980s, quite a lot of this work is in museums, sometimes in strange places in England or in the Netherlands, and we've been able to bring those together, and thanks for all the lenders for supporting us. Now I want to start this talk by reminding you of our collaboration called Internationale. This is the first museum confederation to exist in Europe, and we're now 5 years old, so we celebrate our 50th birthday as Van Abbe celebrates its 80th. This confederation, which consists of museums from Istanbul to Madrid, Antwerp, Ljubljana, of course, Van Abbe or Eindhoven and Barcelona, is a network that tries to bring together a group of institutions that are interested in some fundamental questions about art. Not so much what art to show, or what's valuable, or what's going to get into the press the day after, but more what is the place of art in contemporary society. And I think particularly because we all sit in strange economic and political times, and perhaps times moreover where the old systems of management, which we have come to call democracy, that those systems of management are no longer functioning in ways that we as a society really want. Can the museums be in Istanbul, where it's very urgently needed at the moment, but also here in Eindhoven or in Madrid? Can they be places as a constructive force for that democratic renewal? And how can art support the idea that democracy needs to go further, that our understanding of our systems of management, of governance, need to take a step in a new direction? This seems to me to be a vital question, but it's a question which has a very long history, I think, and it's that history which we address today. We saw, as a group of 6 institutions, and then many other colleagues that joined us from universities and from art academies, we saw that the 1980s was the place where much of the questions that we were generating about why this system doesn't work anymore, even why the museum doesn't really have a place in a system that doesn't work anymore and needs to find a new place, that those questions were originated in the 1980s. If we think simply, there's a process in which the post-Second World War world, a world which was divided into 2 blocks in Europe, a social democratic bloc, more or less, and a communist bloc, came to an end in the 1980s. In a way, it was like a cycle. There are many cycles we can talk about in history. But there's a cycle that ended in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. When also Tiananmen Square happened in China, and the whole economic change in China, which had so much effect on the economy of the world, began to start rolling after Tiananmen. But also when the first person typed www into a computer and didn't get a spell check correction. Suddenly it meant something in 1989. So at the end of the 1980s, there were these visible signs that something had changed. But that change was building throughout the 1980s. That sense that one system was coming to an end and another one was beginning was precisely what the 1980s was about. And I think maybe in Western Europe, perhaps because we had this idea, because of the Berlin Wall, that there was a kind of victory for our system over their system, I think it took us quite some time to realize that it was a profound change on all levels and across the world, and not just the liberation of communism, so-called liberation. I remember always somebody saying we wanted democracy, but we didn't know the free market came as a free gift with it. In Croatia, actually. But that happened all over. Yeah, so there was a form of change that happened, which has had a fundamental effect on where we are. But why I think it's interesting to look at the 1980s now is that that change, which we can call neoliberalism or globalization or whatever, you could find your own word for it, we don't have a definition for it, but that change is coming to an end. That cycle, the cycle which started in 1980 and has run about 35, 36 years, only has a few years left in it, let's be honest. I think we all know that we don't know what's emerging afterwards. So we're very much like we're back in the 1980s. We know that something's coming to an end, but we don't know what's going to happen after. And that's why the 1980s is so interesting. That's why I think it's the decade that we need to look at. Now the question is, how do we need to look at it? We have decided to look at it through the eyes of Internationale, because we see that the 1980s was also a series of stories from different countries. The world, in a sense, in the 1980s was still cut up into nation states with their own cultures, in a way that it's not now, in a way that globalization, neoliberalism, the financialization of the economy, all those things have so radically changed that we no longer feel we have, Philips doesn't really feel a Dutch company anymore. In the 1980s, it belonged to Eindhoven. It was from this place. And that was true for so many companies. That was true for so many governments. That was true for so many institutions. They belonged to their place. So we wanted to tell those particular stories. But we also wanted to tell stories that were very strongly researched, and I will thank in a minute everybody, the curators, for doing all the research. But we wanted to tell stories that were not of what we could say was the mainstream in the 1980s at the time. Because what's interesting in this exhibition is that what you see in the Dutch part of the exhibition, or what you will see in the Dutch part of the exhibition, what you see in the Slovenian part of the exhibition, what you see in the English or British part of the exhibition, I have difficulty saying that word these days. Let's say English for a moment. The English part of the exhibition. What you see in those parts of the exhibitions was not on show in the Stedelijk Museum, in the Moderne Galleria in Ljubljana, or in the Tate in London. These were not the artists that were celebrated in the 80s in their time. They were the artists that to some extent were on the margins. For reasons that we can speculate about, but I think are quite clear, because they voiced the resistance and opposition to the status quo. And that's never, as we know from the Van Abbe, that's never always omarmed. Yeah, that's never always welcome. But it's absolutely essential. And particularly when we look back now, in a way at the end of the era that started in the 1980s, we need to look at what we might call those signals that did not take the journey into the mainstream, but now become all the more vital for it, now become all the more important. And I think what's interesting also is you see in these three exhibitions and in the later exhibitions from Turkey, from Catalonia and from Spain that will come in a few months' time, in July. So there's 6 exhibitions in all. So each of these national stories, if we can give Catalonia a moment a national story, a national identity. I'm happy to do that as a Scottish nationalist, so I'd like to see that as well. but that these various parts of the world and these stories, they have some strange things in common. And one of which is a resistance to the state structures, and, to use a good old-fashioned Yugoslav term, an idea of self-management. Now, that was the idea of Yugoslav socialism, of self-management. And in a sense, you can see in the artist initiatives, you look at that list of artist initiatives in the Netherlands, and you'll see most of the important artist initiatives even alive still today. That was the period when they were created. That was the period where they were brought into existence, and there's been far less institutional creativity since the 1980s than there was then. We have to ask why. Why is that? Why was then an idea of resistance to the state and self-management important? NSK was working directly in relationship to the communist Yugoslav authorities, the sort of empty, symbolic communism that had no meaning anymore by the 1980s. They were working in direct relationship, so of course they weren't recognized by them. In fact, Laibach was banned for a few years from even playing in the 1980s. And the movement in England, the Black British Art Movement, that movement also was not one that was immediately embraced by the establishment in the imperial corridors of London. It was something that had to fight for its voice. There's a beautiful painting by Sonia Boyce in the exhibition where she literally puts herself on the map with a William Morris wallpaper, just trying to be present within that discourse. You know, William Morris, a fascinating figure. In some ways an imperialist, you can dismiss him, also a socialist, also a theorist, also a dreamer. You might want to write yourself into that history, but so much is stopping you from writing yourself into that history, and you have to claim that space. And that's what she does in that work, I think, in a very beautiful way, and it's a perfect example for why these things are not part of the mainstream. So this idea of countercultures is fundamental to where we are now. And I think it's a very important step in our understanding of where the 1980s might lead us to today, of how we can look back. And there's an interesting little coda, I suppose, if you go upstairs to the collection exhibitions on the second floor, the first room on the big floor, which is quite open, where the upside down cave or beetle is, yeah? That floor, the first room there shows the Vanabbemuseum's exhibition and the work that we collected in the 1980s. And it's very, very different. I'm not sure if it was mainstream then. It was still had its own power and its own independence. But it was what became the art world of the 90s and the 2000s. Anyway, it's what unfolded in that system which is now coming to an end. And it looks very, very different. Aesthetically, it's completely different. It's about objects that are closed in. It's not about storytelling. It's about, you know, a sort of a narrow idea of visuality. You know, the human is just an eye and not a body. Somehow, that idea is contained in that work. And I think it's fascinating to compare it with what we're showing now, which would have never come, to be honest, in the Vanabbemuseum in the 1980s. The work that we're showing here would never have been there. I think Patricia was never here in the 1980s as an artist. And that's significant that we can look back, and that's partly the purpose of what we can do as a museum, look back and rewrite those histories. Now I want to thank a few people, and then I want to say one more thing about the book before I introduce Zdenka. I hope I'm not going on too long. I want to thank, first and foremost, all the artists, many of whom I can see here. I'm not going to name everybody, but I'm going to see everybody later on. But just to thank all of them, from Slovenia, from England, and from the Netherlands, who've all come to celebrate the exhibition here, and also very important for us to support us in our endeavours. Internationale and Vanabbemuseum itself, we depend on the support of artists, and we depend on the fact that they are committed to some of the stories that we want to tell. I want to thank you very much, all of you, for being here. I also want to thank the curators of the exhibition, to thank Nick Akins, who's sitting over there, thank Diana França, who's sadly not with us, and to thank Zdenka, without question, of course. But to thank them all for the enormous amount of research that they've done for these exhibitions. If you see in these exhibitions, we are telling stories that aren't normally told, at least not in the forms that they are told today. So this exhibition of NSK, for instance, is really the first time that the three groups, the whole narrative of NSK in Slovenia has been brought together. This is a way of looking at the 80s in the Netherlands or in England, Britain, that is simply not really available in the art history books. Yeah? And it means primary research, and I think I'm very grateful for all the artists for doing that. Sorry, for all the curators for doing that, so thank you a lot to them. Now, I want to end by linking this story of the 1980s and Internationale and everything that we've done with another project which some of you will have been familiar with for some time, which is the project we did around the question of utility and art and the relationship between art. Because this was really one of the main parts of the earlier Internationale research, and it resulted in 3 exhibitions, 2 of which were held here in Eindhoven, the Museum of Arte Util, as some of you might remember, Confessions of the Imperfect, and Really Useful Knowledge, which was an exhibition which was created in Reina Sofia in Madrid. And these exhibitions really tried to bring together an idea of what the place of art in society as actually functioning in social conditions. Does art have a role, if you like, in real life? And what is that role? It's a role which relies on application of imagination, of course. It's a role which always talks in metaphors and similes, as well as literally one-to-one relations. But that role, again, a very long question, is something that needs to be discussed and needs to continue to be discussed if we are to understand why we are where we are and what art can bring to us as a society. So I'm really delighted to say that as a result of all that research, we have produced a publication, which I have here, which is called What's the Use, and which we launch today. And this publication seeks, I think, to do 3 things. It seeks to understand our history, the history of art, in terms of how to imagine the world otherwise. One of my catchphrases, yeah. One of the functions of art is how to imagine the world otherwise than it is. And it's a really hard thing to do. So what happened historically when people imagined the world otherwise? And what can we learn from that in our current condition? How can we apply their imaginations to our world today? Because that imagining of the world otherwise is not singular. It's not one history that we're trying to draw from the past. It's a whole net, a whole fabric of infinite histories. And art is a guide to that infinite web, a guide to how we might draw, at any particular time, histories together to make our common futures. And that's hopefully in this exhibition. It's also how artists understood their practice as social, as related to the world outside the art gallery and outside the museum. And it's finally about how an institution like the museum can respond to those demands of artists. Because we have certain protocols, certain systems, even in architecture, that permits some things very, very easily and makes other things incredibly difficult. And it's often the incredibly difficult things that you want to do in an institution. And part of our role is to change, and that's a slow process, because institutions need to change slowly, otherwise they don't survive 80 years. But it's a slow process and a necessary process to change how we work with people, with artists, with our publics, to change that process so that we can contribute to what I began with, I think, by talking about the needs for a different kind of democracy. So I really urge you, if you have a chance, to have a look at this book and even buy it. It's only €27.50. Because it is really the fruit of about 3 years of research in here, and it's one of the most substantial, if not the most substantial books, I think, that we have produced in the Van Abbe. I'd really like to thank Astrid Forsterman and the team in Valise for helping us produce this. The design, you're in the all the editors. That's Nick, who's here, Stephen Tentire, Thomas Langer from the University of Hildesheim, that also contributed. You're in the Seidel, and also George and Harrison, who are Eindhoven designers, who produced an amazing book. I think I'm really happy with the design of it, and it's very readable. Actually, for once, the typeface is, as I get older, I get more and more grateful to the fact that typeface gets bigger. I noticed that. So I'm really delighted that we've been able to produce this work, and as I say, I think that it will form the basis for thinking about this question into the future. I'm also very happy to say that we're going to produce a series of books with valleys, and I know they're here somewhere, but I can't see. A series of books with valleys, one on the 1980s. So there'll be a book like this, which will come in about a year's time, about precisely the topics that you're seeing in the exhibition now. We always produce these in a way afterwards because it's about the knowledge and the research which we develop also in the process of the exhibition. If you produce it before the exhibition, in a way you're just saying what you already know. If you produce it afterwards, you can reflect on what you've done, and that's far more useful. Also one on the role of the public, a question that we are constantly having in the museum: how can we create an institution where people can meet, where relations can be built? And also on the question of the purpose of the museum itself. So all these books will emerge in the next few years together with Valleys, and we're really happy that we could make this agreement with a wonderful publisher who's really good and also makes us keep our deadlines, because otherwise I think we'd never produce the books at all, so they're absolutely essential. That's basically all I had to say. But I now have the great privilege to introduce a dear friend of mine, and somebody who will talk much more about NSK than I possibly could. But as I say, I think that NSK hold a particular place in this history, but perhaps because they came from a different ideological background. In some ways, you know, I used to say one thing, that people from the former socialist Europe, and now it's kind of dying out because the generation exists that never knew it, but those people like Zdenka that lived through the 80s saw a system change. And so they knew it was possible for systems to change. I'm a complicated history, but basically as a Westerner, I never had the chance to see that. Yeah, I never lived through the end of the Second World War, so I never saw a system collapse, like the NSB system collapsed. Yeah, I never saw that. And at the same time, all I've been presented with most of my life is, you know, there is no such thing as society and there is no alternative. That's the vision I've been offered as a kid. Yeah, that was it. Pretty hard vision, actually, in a strange way. So I always thought that actually, as Westerners, we kind of see with one eye. You know, because we don't really know what can be different. And I think people who experienced real existing communism kind of have two eyes. They can see depth and perspective and things that you can't see with one eye. So that's why I do think that looking at the NSK show and maybe applying it to our current situation, which is also one story. Yeah, there is no alternative. One story that dominates the political headlines. But we know there is so much more. We know in our bodies, in our emotions, in our feelings, there's so much more than that one story. We know it's bullshit, what we're told, and yet we can't get out of it. Well, they got out of it once, and they can teach us how to get out of this one again. So Zdenka, thank you very much.